Welcome to my research proposal. This is for secondary literacy. This is something that has always been really important to me throughout my career, and so when we got the opportunity to explore a topic of our choice, I decided to focus on secondary literacy and our responsibilities as teachers and what that looks like in the classroom. As a secondary teacher who started in middle school, there were many things to learn right off the bat, including how absurd one might have to dress for pep rallies, for example. Um, in addition to that, when I walked in, I was told, hey, you're going to be in charge of tier 2 and tier 3 reading intervention. And my response was kind of awesome. What is that? What does that mean? It was news to me that there would be a significant number of students who weren't reading on grade level. As secondary teachers, we come to English education because we want to share in the joy of reading with our students on a somewhat more advanced level than our elementary counterparts. And my expectation was very much that students are going to be able to read when they come to me. It just was not something that was talked about in my undergraduate education and teacher training program. So while there was all this other new stuff to learn, I also had to learn about these interventions and what that means. And in talking to fellow teachers, I found that this was not just a me problem. It's easy for us here in 2025 to assume that this problem has started because of the pandemic. Unfortunately, due to some literacy reading debates in the elementary world, these problems have existed since well before the pandemic. The pandemic, I do think, made some of these problems worse, but the problems were definitely already there. And what the problem is, as a middle school teacher, I saw students coming to me in 7th grade reading on a 4th or 5th grade level, sometimes even a 3rd grade level. And very rarely I had students who read on a 1st or 2nd grade level. As a 10th grade teacher, I'm seeing those gaps widen. As a 10th grade teacher, I have students coming to me reading on a 4th or 5th grade level as a 10th grader, which is very different than a 4th or 5th grade level as a 7th grader. So the gaps seem to be getting a little bigger and a little more widespread as far as students go. There are mechanisms in place to help students. We have resource classes, we have RTI classes. Unfortunately, rather than doing intervention, what I find at the high school level is most of this time is spent completing assignments for classes. The goal is to get students credit and to help them graduate on time, because research shows us it doesn't really do students any good when they fail. And so we really put a lot of time and effort into helping them stay on top of their classes. While I don't think that is a negative thing, I do think not addressing the reading gaps is harming them more than helping them pass their classes is helping them. So we have to find what's the right balance. How can we help them, and where do we go from here? My research questions kind of span a range. How can I address the literacy needs of my students in a secondary classroom that helps them do more than get by? And with get by, I mean pass. Students can get by an English 10 class. They can get a 60, but I'm not sure how well that's serving them if I'm really not helping them address some of their literacy gaps. And so I want them to be able to pass without working quite as hard as they're working, because the work I want them to put in is to close the reading gaps, because I think that naturally is going to help everything else. So the question is also, how can I engage struggling readers in a way that helps them gain both confidence and competence when approaching grade level text across the curriculum? And I think the most challenging parts of my questions have to do with what is practical but also what is not going to feel demeaning for my students. It's a hard thing for an adult to admit that they cannot read well. And it's just as hard for our high school students to admit that they can't read well. And many of our students don't want the social stigma attached to of getting extra help or getting remediation. However, if I can save them from a remedial reading class, which is becoming more and more common in colleges, I think the effort now and the time spent now could be really beneficial for them. In doing my literature review, I found 3 major threads that I'm going to kind of talk you through. The big one is the elementary reading wars. I do think that has had a significant impact on why our students have the gaps that they have. I can say that I feel like the elementary reading wars have kind of come to a close, or at least a compromise, and I think students are better served for it. However, we still have many students coming into our classrooms right now that have significant gaps that developed as a result of these wars. The second thread is intervention strategies and what that looks like. And the third thread, which I've already alluded to, is teacher preparation. We are not trained to teach people how to read as secondary ELA teachers. And the reality for most of us is that we are being tasked with teaching students the foundational reading skills that they need. This is something that I feel like I could talk about for too long, but I will try to summarize it for you guys in a concise way. There is a podcast by Emily Hanford, an educational reporter, who decided to investigate these reading wars, and I think she does a really good job creating a narrative that is easy to follow. And much of this depends on phonics instruction, and her investigation of this emerged during the pandemic, after asking questions when she and her friends were dealing with their students in kindergarten and first grade trying to learn how to read. Much of the reading wars center around phonics instruction, and so there is a movement that was called the whole language movement, not to be confused with the whole word method. And these things had huge impact on reading practices throughout the years. So this all kind of started in the 1960s with Dr. Marie Clay. She wanted to understand why people struggled to read. And the idea behind whole language instruction is essentially, if we create a literacy-rich environment that is highly motivating and provides the right sort of materials, the children will figure out how reading works. So with this new approach, Marie Clay identified struggling readers and studied them for a year. She developed this program called Reading Recovery and something called the 3 cueing system, which you may have heard of. And the idea here is that a student looks at a word, they use the context, the syntax, and the visual information to determine what the word means. Phonics does not play a role in the 3 cueing system. So sounding out a word is seen by Dr. Marie Clay as something that is demeaning and not useful for a reader. It's not something a mature reader would do, according to Dr. Marie Clay. Her theories emerged in New Zealand in the 1960s, but they dominate literacy instruction in the United States into the 2010s. Her system does rest on the idea that learning to sound out words is a demeaning task and a sign of someone who is truly a struggling reader. She believed that students naturally learn to read by reading. Irene Fontes and Gesu Pinnell, you may have heard of Fontes and Pinnell reading levels. They carried this idea forward. They create a system, they create leveled readers that match up with different grade levels, and all of this that they're teaching and that they're putting out, the strategies they're putting forth, the lesson ideas they're putting forth, they're building on this 3 cueing system. They're backing off of phonics instruction. Lucy Calkins of the Teachers College at Columbia carries this idea forward as well. Phonics all but disappeared from elementary school literacy programs across the country. Emily Hanford, who created this podcast, breaks this story in 2022, and through her advocacy with the podcast, with people responding to the podcast, with things that she was discovering, movement started. Phonics has re-entered the mainstream conversation, and you'll start to hear about things like Science of Reading now, and what that does is it tries to merge what does work from the work that's been done by Marie Clay, Fountas and Pinnell, and Lucy Calkins with phonics instruction and what that means for students. These are names that I have heard throughout my time in education. I have spent a good amount of time attending early literacy things as an attempt to understand what my students on the secondary level need. And these names, Fountas and Pinnell in particular, and Lucy Calkins, are significant. I mean, there are people that still would smile like they just met Beyonce if they got in a room with Lucy Calkins. That is how big she is in the literacy world. The second half of the Elementary Reading Wars has to do with background knowledge. So our students struggle with phonics and fluency. That's definitely an issue. But the other side of their struggle has to do with this knowledge gap. As named by Natalie Wexler, she describes this as the hidden cause of America's broken education system. What happens with things like the Alabama Literacy Act that says all students have to pass this reading test is that elementary teachers have started focusing on reading skills. So if I take out a book about the planets, that's a nonfiction book that I am going to read with my elementary students, I'm trying to make sure they can name things like a caption and a subheading and a heading and a chapter breakdown. I want to make sure they understand the text structure and how to identify those things. And I assess their knowledge of how to identify such things rather than assessing their knowledge of the planets. And so what's happening is students are reading nonfiction books, they're reading fiction books. Those things are true, but they're focused on the skill of reading rather than any content-rich lessons. So science and social studies time in elementary schools has shrunk significantly since the Alabama Literacy Act. And I think one of the things that makes this really challenging for us is that students are coming to us, and there's an argument to be made that like memorizing things is not good for anybody. I know that the year 1080 was really important, but I couldn't tell you why. So there's an element where I know memorizing these facts doesn't do any good, but what's challenging is that our students, they're not having to memorize any of that stuff. And so they don't know that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. They don't know, or they aren't sure who won the Civil War. They know there was a Civil War, and they know that the South was kind of a big player in that. And so some of them actually would say the South won the Civil War. They don't know who Paul Revere is. And so what's happening when they're approaching a grade level text that makes an allusion to any type of thing like that, they don't have the background knowledge to make meaning from that allusion or that reference to science or anything else. So where we do have Google and it is easy to look something up, it's challenging to become a reader that can just approach a grade level text and do well with it, especially in time circumstances where we're doing these things, if they don't know the allusions. They're having to do too much work to understand the basics of the text, if that makes sense. Freebody and Luke are some researchers who in 1990 outlined 4 roles related to becoming a successful reader that I think are really useful. Code breaker, as in how do I crack this? Text participant, what does this mean? That is where I feel like our high school students are kind of stuck. They're struggling to code break because they don't have the background knowledge, and that prohibits them from leaning fully into text participant because they can't make meaning out of what they see. The next two steps are text user, what do I do with this here and now, and then text analysis, what does all of this mean to me? And so I would argue that our high school English standards are reaching for our students to be a text user and a text analyst by the time they reach high school. But I find that many students are still struggling with this code breaker and text participant role. The second thread I found in my research was intervention in the secondary classroom. And to be honest, there's not a ton of research out there about how to do intervention in the secondary classroom. It's still a field that's very much building. So what I found in the research is that a lot of people have tried the effects of various elementary intervention practices on the secondary classroom. So I found one study, for example, that focused on repeated fluency intervention. They used a lot of guided reading practices, such as repeated reading plus vocabulary preview. And what these found is that the results of using these interventions for students in high school typically had either no effect or a positive effect, depending on the student. It did help, is the takeaway, I think. But what's challenging is that it wasn't like a significant help. It found that small group reading instruction really helped teachers understand their students better and see how resilient they were. But that didn't always translate into a really positive student performance. The studies I looked at used these methods and had really small samples of students, so 4 to 6 students. I think further research into that and some more consistency could yield some more significant results because they did see some positive effects. But unfortunately, there wasn't a whole lot that I saw that really led me to believe elementary reading practices are the way to go. At ISTE and at the National Writing Project, I discovered some programs that sound promising that could be potentially used in my study as part of what I'm doing. One is the Really Great Reading Program. This is the booth that I saw at ISTE, and it was really interesting because one of their focuses in training their teachers is helping us secondary teachers understand how the phonics instruction can really work and how that would look. I think it's challenging because I do think it's going to feel childish to some of our students. But I also think that our students are really resilient and that they learn quickly. They are sponges. And so I think Really Great Reading should promise, because it was like truly training you in those foundational aspects of literacy education that I think we need. And then at National Writing Project, I had the opportunity to work with a secondary literacy coach who uses Reading Horizons Elevate for her schools in Jefferson County, Alabama. And so this is another program that I'm really interested in. She said it's had some really, really positive effects in her district. And similarly, it has a phonics element that she said students don't resist all that much, at least in her middle schools. And so these are two programs that I think have potential. They have the elementary side that I think is really not so fun for students, but they also seem to offer results, which is important. Pre-service teacher education, as well as continuing teacher education, is the third side of the scholarship that I think became a big issue as I was doing this. As English teachers, we are not taught to teach someone how to read in the fundamental sense of the word. If you look at teacher education programs, it's clear that students are expected to come to us already reading because we're not given classes in those foundational reading skills. As an English teacher attending professional development over the years, I also know kind of the classroom reality and what it looks like. I've got this statistic here: 37% of 8th graders perform below the National Assessment of Education Progress basic literacy level. In the classroom, I see students struggle. Each year I typically teach about 75 students in English 10. It's a grade level course. It's required for graduation. In that group, I think it's fair to say that 15 to 30% of students in my class have some kind of plan. This could be a 504. This could be an English language learning plan. This could be an IEP. But it almost always means that the student has a documented reading challenge when something like that comes up and that they read below grade level. So the percentage of students who have no plan but read below grade level is also there and can range anywhere from 15 to 30%. So in one of my core classes, it could be anywhere from 30 to 60% that aren't reading at grade level. Now, math is not my strong suit, so don't hold me too hard to my numbers, but just trying to count out in my previous classes what that reality was. It's just really clear that there's a need for literacy training. What I have found throughout the years is going to professional development and buying the books. I've been exposed to teachers that I adore. Donalyn Miller, Penny Kittle, Kelly Gallagher, Jim Burke. These are icons to me. I've been blessed enough to meet several of them, and it really does feel like I've won the lottery. And I've learned many things from them throughout the years that have been really useful in my classroom. They are practices that I have continued for years and years thanks to these wonderful teachers who decided to share their knowledge. However, I think there's a gap there too, and it has to do with this whole idea of literacy training. All of these books say the best way to become a better reader is to read. The research says the best way to become a better reader is to read. The problem is that as secondary teachers, we have students coming to us who lack the fundamental skills like fluency and phonemic awareness to become better readers. They can't read well enough to really push themselves outside of the grade level stuff they've been sticking to. That's why I have 7th graders who still want to read Diary of a Wimpy Kid, for example. The context for my study is a large public high school in Alabama. We have 3 grade levels, 10 through 12, with about 2,100 students, so it is very large. The graduation rate is 96%. We have about 4% ESL learners, 14% students with disabilities, and 18% of students with economic disadvantages. According to state testing data, we have 53% of students who are proficient in reading. It's a number that's gone down over the years. I don't have a lot of curriculum constraints, which is helpful. We have to give a common midterm and a common final exam, but we get a lot of freedom within the English 10 classroom that I think is really beneficial to me when trying to plan a study like this. I can do some small group interventions or some tutoring programs, perhaps with one of the products I mentioned above, and that's going to be okay with my administration and with my department, as long as I give that common midterm and common final exam. For my study, what I would like to do is to implement some kind of reading intervention strategy, whether it's a program or a specific set amount of strategies like the repeated reading things on a consistent basis with a small group of my struggling readers. I would like to assess a couple of things throughout this study, and I think the attitude towards reading is a big piece of this, whether we like it or not. In the age of AI, Especially, I think we're really dealing with a lot of what do I need school for whenever my phone can just do it for me. And so I think the attitudes towards reading are going to be kind of a big piece of what's going to help me understand how students do or do not overcome their reading gaps. So, some strategic student surveys, probably for my entire class, is going to be kind of a first step in understanding the moment that we're in. Then I would like to keep a research journal to help me, as well as field notes. And I see these as two separate things, though they probably will exist in the same notebook. In the research journal, I want to document my reflections on the process. I want to reflect on the student surveys. I want to reflect on the lessons that I implement, whether it's through a program or something else that I've come up with. I want to take time and reflect on those classroom moments. For field notes, I really just want to take kind of objective notes about what's happening in the student lives or in the day. For example, if our football team is winning, it generally means my football students are a little more active in class. We have students with football. Football is a first block class, but on Wednesdays, they have a 6 a.m. practice, and then they watch film in class. And so by the time students come to me in second block, they can be really worn out. I want to make notes of things like students that seem sleepy or distracted, and just make sure I have those kind of contextual things in my field notes that might be relevant. I would like to conduct student interviews throughout the process, probably a beginning, middle, and end of semester interview. I want to ask them about their attitudes, like I talked about. Towards reading in particular, I want to know how they spend their free time. I want to know what their attitudes towards reading at home are. Do they see their parents reading? How are they playing into this? I'd like to get stakeholder input. I don't know how realistic this is, but I think it would be really interesting to talk to parents or guardians. I also think it would be interesting to talk to resource teachers, for example, or other content teachers, whether that's in an actual interview or in some kind of survey, just to note, did we see any changes? I think that could be really interesting. Throughout the study, I would like to collect artifacts from the students. This could be, a beginning of the semester writing sample as well as an end of the semester writing sample. I think writing is a really effective way to see what a student understands from a text. So short reading responses collected over time could give me a concrete way to analyze a student's growth, for example. And I'd also like to capture student reading levels at the beginning, middle, and end. My school does use star reading, which could be something I'm allowed to use to get that benchmark data. If not, I may have to research some other methods of doing that. And after collecting all of this data, I'd like to really take some time to pull it all together, construct a narrative of each student, see what worked for who and how we got there. A lot of how that end product, what that end product could look like, will depend on how this goes and what works. So my next steps here are to talk to curriculum people at my school and see if any of these programs are an option, to see if I could potentially get trained in some kind of secondary literacy practices, and just see what's available. And once I know what's available, I'll be able to have some more concrete ideas about how this study could realistically really play out in my classroom, because it's something that I do think I would really like to do, if I could get the resources I need and the support from administration. As far as the significance of the study goes, I do think it's important to note that 23.9% of adults in Alabama have low literacy. I think people with a functional level of literacy are better able to participate in our democracy. And I think that means a lot of different things. I think people with a functional level of literacy are less likely to run into financial problems because they fell for some kind of scam, or I think they're better able to advocate for themselves if they're having trouble with something in their apartment that their landlord doesn't want to pay for. I think a functional level of literacy is important for thriving in society, and I think that's the least we can do for our students, is give them the tools that they need to do more than just survive high school. I want them to be able to go into the world and to get a job that brings them some joy, and to be able to have their families and their lives look the way that they really want them to. And I do think literacy is at the heart of that. And I don't mean this in a cliche way. I really think literacy serves our students well, and I think it serves people well, and I want that for everyone. I want them to be able to take care of themselves, and I think literacy is at the heart of that. There's potential for harm in this study. Learning to read is challenging. Admitting that you are struggling to read is challenging. My nephew, who is going into second grade, doesn't like to admit that he can't read. And it's hard for him. I can only imagine how difficult it is for a 10th grader to say, you're right, Miss Hope, I need help. And so all of those things are going to be factors in how this plays out. But I think the significance is definitely that if we can help our students get through high school and gain that confidence that they need to approach a text, then I think we're really going to help them do more than get by out in the real world just as much. Thank you for bearing with me. I don't know if you can hear him or not, but my dog is crying that it is bedtime, so it makes me feel like I might have put you through a lot, and I hope it was not too terrible. I've really enjoyed this class. I did include my references on the next page for anyone who is interested, and I appreciate